Thank you. Okay. Shall we start? Yeah, so people are now getting in. Moving on your, let's say, you can check. Okay. So the last people are coming, take a seat. Okay, good morning, and welcome to the ERCST meeting room, physical meeting room. Yes, you see that we are all here. All the speakers will be present in this meeting. So if you are connected, you are on the ERCST channel, if I could say so, we will have a meeting which was selected by the European Hydrogen Week, and I'm sure that a lot of people here has already attended those events. So welcome to you. Okay. So the ERCST will be on the principle of technological neutrality and hydrogen incentives. It is quite important because here we need to really create the hydrogen economy, and we have done a lot of meeting event in order to understand and support all the regulation which was provided by the Commission, and I could tell you that there is a lot which was done by the Commission. So that is for Ruud Kepner, who is with us. But it is quite difficult, now, to see if all is present. So we have done some analysis on that. There will be a presentation of what we have seen on all those regulations. I think that it is quite important, to have this broad view for all the actors which want to enter in this market. And those who want to enter in this market want to have first a clear definition of what we have to, let's say, use as hydrogen, what are the, let's say, connection between those type of hydrogen, and what are the incentive for the first time. So the incentive in this period is a key for creating the market. We hope that in 2030, we will have a market which will run, which will be effective, but we still have a cost question about the renewable hydrogen, about all those new technology, and we need to really, let's say, have the industry having the possibility to master those technology. And I remember that was, let's say, in the meeting that we had yesterday, someone said that we do not have a lot of time because these industries are heavy industries, and there is one of I'm not sure that we could say two cycle of investment before 2050. I don't want to, let's say, address 2030. 2030, it's more prototype, it's more pilot plant, it's more, let's say, a series of installations that we need to start, we need to master. So it is quite interesting, to have the view of all the players which are here in the room, and first to have maybe the possibility to get the, let's say, the remark from the Commission, because obviously we have already sent a lot of message to the Commission, and the Commission is providing information, communicating that. Last but not least, we had a communication from Timmermans on the 25th. I don't want to, maybe you would like to, let's say, develop that, but it was a good communication because we have seen that there is money and that the Commission believe, let's say, in this hydrogen economy. So I will leave, obviously, Ruud to develop what is in the mind of Timmermans. But it's already a good the good news. There are all also other questions. So we will obviously ask the other questions. So maybe we will start by, let's say, a presentation from Antonio on what we have seen today as are the key elements of the, let's say, of these topics. And then after, we will leave the floor to Rud to give us, let's say, the last information, last communication, and maybe some good news on these aspects. Thank you, Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Olivier, and thank you everybody for being here with us today. So the topic of today's discussion for our event, which is, by the way, as Olivier mentioned, part of the European Hydrogen Week, it's a side event. So we have to say that at least. So the topic of the discussion is the principle of technological neutrality and hydrogen incentives. So there is where we will focus. And this is a brief presentation from my side to set the scene for discussion and introduce the topics. I will address the 3 questions that are pretty much aligned with the questions you have on your agendas. So we will first look at hydrogen incentives in the EU legislative framework and assess if they are technologically neutral or not. Then we will try to elaborate a bit more about why this is important. And then we will address the question how to support the demand side of the market in light of regulatory framework that is shaping, and also in light of the current energy crisis. So are hydrogen incentives in the EU regulatory framework technologically neutral? So first of all, what we understand as incentives being technologically neutral are those that support both renewable and low carbon hydrogen, right? And then 2 quick considerations, because it's very difficult, first of all, to compare incentives that are from a different nature and their impact on the development of the market and the market behavior. You cannot compare probably the price signal of the ETS that is technologically neutral with the standards or with targets on the demand side that are probably the strongest ones. So we have tried, and so we think that we have some examples of technology neutral targets for hydrogen. So we take the ETS and its price signal. The ETS funding mechanisms, of course, that cover a wide range of technologies. Then we have in the transport sector the CO2 standards for cars and vans that introduce a phase out for date for internal combustion engines without telling us which technology we should use. Or for sure, the state aid guidelines for climate, environmental protection and energy that, of course, include the possibility to use state aid for the low carbon hydrogen. Then we have some of them which are quite difficult to categorize. One example is the taxonomy that, for example, includes what can be called a definition of sustainably producing hydrogen, right? This could be called technologically neutral because it's based on GHG emission threshold, but in the end, it's very difficult to meet if not with renewables. So we can call it both, let's say. Then we have the hydrogen and gas package. This is still shaping. Let's see if this will include in the end some sort of incentives for the low carbon hydrogen. Another example is the refuel EU aviation, when the Council position includes a definition for synthetic low carbon fuels, which includes low carbon hydrogen. And this should count towards the sustainable aviation fuel obligations. So we could consider that if this passes, because now it's in the trial of technologically neutral. Then carbon contract for difference. This is shaping right now. There are 2 workshops that are being organized by the Clima that they are taking place this week and in November. And according to REPowerEU, just renewable hydrogen and its application in industry will be financed through these instruments. So let's see what happens. But in principle, this will cover just renewable hydrogen. And then the EU Hydrogen Bank. We don't know a lot of things about that. So let's see if it's funding or guarantees, or to be honest, I don't have much information. It used for both high renewable and low carbon. So why do we think that the technological neutrality is important? So, well, we have to think a little bit now on the demand side of the market, and the demand side needs sufficient volumes of hydrogen at affordable prices, right? So if the demand side is to achieve the target in the red, let's see how this shape. And the hydrogen market is to be ramped up before 2030, that is the ambition. Renewable hydrogen alone may not be enough, and I think that is recognized as well by the hydrogen strategy, right? So against this backdrop, there are three non-exclusive options. There are probably more, but we want to highlight three. So we could make some of the elements of the renewable hydrogen definition more flexible during a transition period. This could be counted as an incentive. We could also take a technologically neutral approach and make low carbon hydrogen count towards the targets in the red during a transition period. It could be another option. Or we could reduce the European Commission ambition, including the 50 or 75% RFMBO target. Because if we are imposing a target on some industries, and these industries are going to have some difficulties to fulfill, probably another option would be just to reduce these targets. And the other factor that we want to highlight is that Europe is not alone, as you all know. So I guess we want to remain competitive in an increasingly competitive global market. So we all know what the US has proposed with a tax credit that is supposed to be a more pragmatic approach to incentives. So many of the details are still, I think, to be hammered out. But yeah, so these two things. And then coming back to industry and how to support industry, we are all aware that there is an energy crisis now, and many industries are being forced to close because they cannot afford producing anymore. This is really very, very serious. I mean, of course, there are many people working on that, so I don't think we will invent something new. So this is a real problem, but it could be also considered an opportunity. Why? Because at natural gas prices of today, for example, at $100 megawatt hours, which equals more or less in the table in the right $30 million BTUs. This is from the International Energy Agency. Renewable hydrogen becomes competitive today in Europe. So against this backdrop, again, we have different options that maybe we should combine them together so we can do business as usual and subsidize the consumption of natural gas, right? Then we could accelerate leveraging on the existing prices and accelerate the deployment of renewable hydrogen and other forms of low carbon hydrogen other than from gas, where probably we have the problem now. But we think this option requires the adoption of a technologically neutral approach to incentives, both on the production and the demand side of the market. And third, that I don't know if this is the option we want to have. We may want to import the final product, let's say ammonia fertilizers, and in the future green steel from third countries with better access to cheap renewable electricity and natural gas. So of course there will be more options, but we wanted to highlight these three. And this is all from my side. Now, so back to you. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Antonio. And yes, I mean, we had tried to exaggerate the option, but we want to obviously have the possibility to get a good debate on that. So I will take, let's say, now time, I mean, to make and to introduce the people, because I mean, now I think that we are all in the room and we have, let's say, all the people attending the Zoom meeting. So here we will have, so let's introduce myself, Olivier Imbeau, Senior Fellow at ERCST. I should, let's say, send the apologies from Andre, who has not let's say, the possibility to attend the meeting for personal reason. But the question is now to have the possibility to know better the text. So we will have the preliminary remark from the Commission given by Ruud Kepner from the European Commission at the DG Energy. Ruud is team leader for hydrogen financing and international at the renewables and energy system. So thanks, Ruud, to accepted this invitation. And there is something which is, let's say, quite important for me, because Ruud was, let's say, one of the key people in developing the hydrogen strategy. And I think that if we have, let's say, a very good paper at the beginning about the hydrogen strategy. So that's why my personal, let's say, thanks to Ruud for this paper, because it was really the paper who gave them the possibility to, let's say, start all our investment in this, let's say, new hydrogen economy. So the panel discussion will see first of all, just arrive Marion Labattu from EDF, Deputy Director for European Affairs. I'm sure that Marion will have a lot of, let's say, view on low carbon hydrogen, maybe. Okay. Then we will have Luc Austermans from Yara, who will represent the consumer and the big consumer. So he's the head of the EU Affairs and Industrial Relations here in Brussels. Then we will have the chance, to have Esther Bollendorf from Can Europe, and she is senior EU gas policy coordinator. A lot of experience. I don't want to, let's say, quote the number of years that will appear in the agenda. I'm sure that you will have, let's say, the possibility to give us these experience and to share this experience with that. Then Simon Pujol from France Hydrogen, Public Affairs Officer. I think that France is trying, to start a lot of projects on hydrogen, and maybe because they have some, let's say, a connection with some type of electricity, they may have some, let's say, idea in back of their mind about low carbon hydrogen. And Arthur Dimmer, let's say, from Solar Power Europe. So we will give us the view of the renewable electricity, and I'm sure that Arthur, you will have to ask a lot of questions maybe to the Commission to get, let's say, maybe more detail of what was the Timmermans announcement 2 days ago. So are we ready to the debate? And I will start, let's say, by Ruud for his first introductory remark. Ruud, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm taking the challenge of the ERCST seriously, in that we need to have a debate. Yeah. And if we are having a debate on technology neutrality, and you invite someone from the European Commission from the renewables unit, then of course that's a scene for kind of having a proper discussion on that. Now, for my introductory remarks, I actually have not tapped into my experience at the European Commission. Of course, part of that has been translated in the hydrogen strategy, but also previously, where I actually worked on innovation policy, energy innovation policy, where technology neutrality was one of the key aspects. And so to start this debate, I actually would like to challenge some of the concepts which was presented both in the note and in the presentation at the beginning. And so the first concept I want to challenge is the use of the word hydrogen economy. If you read through the hydrogen strategy, you'll see that the word hydrogen economy doesn't appear there. And that was a very deliberate choice for two reasons. First of all, in terms of all of our analysis, we see that climate neutrality cannot be achieved without hydrogen, especially to decarbonize the end use sectors. But if you look at the range of scenarios, and we really look not only at our scenarios, at the range of scenarios is somewhere between 5, actually some, so it's less than that, to 15% of energy consumption in 2030. So it's significant, but it's not an economy running on hydrogen, as we don't say we have a textile economy or we don't have a water economy. We have it's a part of the energy mix for sure, for certain, but we won't have an economy running on hydrogen. The second element, which I would like to talk about and put on the table, is indeed the market. Again, at the moment, there is no market for hydrogen. Even in the current gray hydrogen consumption, most of that hydrogen is produced on site. I think only 15% of all the hydrogen consumed today in Europe is in some form kind of merchant. But again, there it runs through private pipelines. So these are kind of bilateral contracts. So there is no market today. And why is that important in this discussion of technology neutrality? Because in a lot of the academic discussion on technology neutrality, we're talking about technology neutrality if we have multiple technologies which are at a level playing field and need to compete to get into the market. And there we say the market can do that a lot better than someone at the European Commission to choose those technologies. But today we don't have a market. We are creating the market. And that puts a very different perspective on this whole discussion, I think, on technology neutrality. Then there's another element which I would like to put forward, and that is the idea of the carbon footprint. And it is also interestingly because that has come up, of course, in the discussion with the Inflation Reduction Act of the US government. So what we have today in legislation, partly already in legislation, partly proposed, is that we essentially set a threshold of what we think is low carbon hydrogen in general. I use the broad term now, everything. And that is equivalent to about 3.4 kilos of CO2 per kilo of hydrogen. So if you compare that to gas-based hydrogen, which is around 10, anything which is produced below the 3.4, we call renewable or low carbon hydrogen. So there's a very specific threshold which we have there, which is similar to the US IRA, where the threshold is 4. Now, an important element also in both of them, the 3.4 we have in the EU legislation already since a long time, and the 4 in the US, is that it's life cycle emissions. So you really look not only at the production, but also kind of delivering that to the end consumer. Now, why do I mention this threshold? Because the threshold for the low carbon hydrogen in the EU is actually derived from the threshold that we have for biomass fuels as well. So essentially, from that perspective, we have a threshold which applies to what we think are all kind of low carbon fuels in general, which we also apply to hydrogen. So there, in terms of the technology neutrality, we create one level playing field. Whether you're biomass fuel, whether you're low carbon hydrogen, when you're renewable hydrogen, whatever biomass or renewable or low carbon fuel you have one threshold. Now that brings us then to the discussion on what is technology within the hydrogen economy. And here, what the European strategy does, the European hydrogen strategy, is that it essentially doesn't talk about technology. It talks about the energy source. And it makes a clear distinction there. On the one hand side, you have hydrogen, which is produced from a renewable energy source. And you have hydrogen, which is produced from a non-renewable energy source. Now, in terms of the production of renewable hydrogen, this can be in different, can be achieved through different technologies. We know all the different forms of electrolyzers which are available, but you have also, especially if you use biomass, other forms in terms of pyrolysis, gasification, whatever. So there is a range of technologies there. Same for actually low carbon hydrogen. So in low carbon hydrogen, we're not talking about whether this is electrolyzers, which would be the case if you use nuclear power, or whether you use CCS or ATR technologies to get kind of more low carbon hydrogen production, for example, from natural gas or even from biogas, if you want to do that, but then it falls into another category. So again, the strategy talks about the sources and makes a differentiation between the source of the energy, not necessarily the technology. Why do we make that differentiation? It's also part of the European Union acquis. We, as the European Commission, have a clear kind of guidance in that we have to promote the uptake of renewable energy through all member states. And that's where it's derived from. So that's why we also have a differentiation there. Secondly, and that will be interesting to hear as well, what we've seen also from the market is that there is a clear want to differentiate between that hydrogen that is produced from renewable energy sources and that is from low carbon sources. And you also see that in terms of products which are being produced from hydrogen, that you have already a differentiation there. So that's why that differentiation is there. Now, there's two other elements which I want to put into the mix, which are very interesting in terms of this whole discussion about technology neutrality. So on the one hand side, you have the possibilities to produce hydrogen, where already part of it are existing assets. So if you have, for example, a steam methane reforming plant, which is 95% of hydrogen production today, you already have an existing asset and you can convert it into a low carbon hydrogen by putting CCS on top of that. Now, in the low carbon hydrogens of the European hydrogen strategy, that has explicitly been recognized. We have existing installations in the short term with these assets in place. It makes a lot of sense to use the assets, add something on top of that and make it low carbon. So that's why indeed the strategy also says in the short term, that is one of the elements to look at. Now, the question is, we're looking at the long term. Does that also make sense in the long term to still build new assets, using natural gas to make that same low carbon hydrogen? And here, I think the European hydrogen strategy says that's not the case. Building new assets based on natural gas would be inconsistent with what we want in 2050. So you make a clear distinction between we have assets today and assets in the future. Actually, the same applies to hydrogen produced from electricity. So on the one hand side, we used to have in 2020 electricity, which resulted in cheap prices. And in some countries, in particular France, but also Sweden, actually you have electricity which is also decarbonized. So in those particular cases, you can use the existing assets, which is the existing electricity mix, to produce hydrogen. 2022, that's not the case anymore. So what we're talking about in terms of renewable hydrogen is slightly different in that we are also asking there to add new assets to the system. So it's not taking away electricity, which is already there and which is now actually being scarce, but we're actually asking to add new assets to the system in order to make sure that we are not taking away from what we have today in the energy system. And that's why also the hydrogen strategy and the energy system integration strategy were published at the same time. We clearly see there an interaction, and that's what is kind of played out through kind of all of those of our policy frameworks. Now, then the last point which I want to discuss is demand. You said indeed, do we have sufficient, would it be sufficient to have only renewable hydrogen? And then I'm not talking about only electricity. Do we have enough renewable energy sources available to meet the demand in 2030? Now, the targets which we set in the Fit for 55 package, again, had this in mind. So a target of industry of 50% had in mind that today we are already using almost all of the hydrogen consumed in the industry sector is actually natural gas based. You could make that low carbon hydrogen, and that's why the renewable target is 50%. The other 50% would be in the short term or other technologies. Now, in the long term, again, like we said, there we have the idea that renewable hydrogen is compatible with the carbon neutrality, and that's why there the source, not the technology, is the priority there. Now, the other question is, if we have demand, how can we then make sure that we have sufficient production? And one of the options is to lower the demand, but we're not in favor of that. We actually said we have to increase the targets in the REPowerEU plan, going even beyond what we put on the table legislatively in July 2021. But what we do think is that we can increase the production. And there we can increase the production, and we've already started that through a whole different kind of support schemes. Since the market is not there, we've created the state aid and the IPCEIs, which already, if you add that up, is about 10 billion euros. And then we have the RRF, of course, which has another 10 billion euros. So we already have quite a lot of kind of financial support available there to make that production. And there in the production, like you said, we are kind of much more likely to have the demand set because that's the long-term target, but in the production, we have renewable and low carbon hydrogen. Now with the REPowerEU plan, which has a clear target of getting rid of natural gas as soon as possible, there's a clear shift again towards prioritizing renewable energy. And that will also be reflected in the European Hydrogen Bank. Because what we want to do is we have the target for 2030, we're creating demand for 2030, but we're now saying well before 2030, we need to do more to get rid of natural gas. And of course, we can't do that by requesting more natural gas for low carbon production. We need to go for the other sources, which is renewable hydrogen. Now, I would say if we can build a nuclear power station for 2027, let's do that as well. But I don't think that's going to happen. So that's indeed where the whole kind of prioritization of the European Hydrogen Bank comes in. So that is a little bit of kind of the preliminary remarks. I haven't given, well, I think I've given some answers, but I left sufficiently open, I think, for debate for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, because I mean, yes, it is clear in your mind and in the hydrogen strategy, this, let's say, evolution of how to create, not obviously a hydrogen economy, but at least in the future hydrogen market to be more humble. The question maybe that is on the table is that the regulation does not reflect maybe all these clarity that you have in your mind. So, and it is not, let's say, fault of the Commission, because I mean, I know that the Commission has made a lot of proposals about some delegated acts, some definition on renewable hydrogen, waiting for maybe the gas package for the low carbon hydrogen, because obviously when you are investing, you need to finance the investment, you need to make your business plan, and you need to get some strong definition to have the possibility to be supported by all the people giving that. So maybe it is this, let's say, reason why we have, let's say, this feeling that there is something missing or some clarity which is missing in the today regulation, and maybe an urgency that we need to, let's say, put on the table. But there is this energy crisis, which could be a real pain of the neck, or could be a fantastic opportunity. So that is the reason of the debate and the reason of this clarification. And thank you, I mean, to have opened the debate, because coming back to the principle, coming back to the idea of the Commission. Thanks a lot. And we will start the discussion by Marion.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Ruud, for presenting your views. I think we've been in touch on these matters for quite a long time now. I would like maybe to start by saying that today only 10% of the hydrogen projects being developed or in some sort of pipeline are making a final investment decision. I don't know exactly what's the figure, but the number of megawatts of electrolyzers that have been added to the system since the European hydrogen strategy is probably not as high as what the Commission or Hydrogen Europe had in mind, or where we should be today compared to the 10 million tons of EU-based hydrogen that we have to produce by 2030. So I think the sector is now really waiting for clarity on first definitions, and second on where can the hydrogen contribute in a meaningful way to decarbonize. So on the definitions, I think what's key is really to ensure that we don't increase emissions with the production of hydrogen. That's really the basis, and for that we need good rules, a robust approach on renewables to ensure that we're not producing renewable hydrogen with things that are not really decarbonized. And on the low carbon hydrogen that you mentioned, I mean, there are projects. We have projects at EDF to produce low carbon hydrogen with low carbon electricity in France. There are projects in Sweden, in Finland. We want to make sure that this complies with the 70% emission reduction or the taxonomy threshold. But today, what's in the delegated act, which says how to calculate emissions, and I'm aware that it's only for transport now, and that it will need to be detailed through the gas package and other delegated acts. But of course, we all know how the EU works, and once you get something in a proposal, most probably it will be reused later down the road. So there, I think a fair approach is needed, and I mean, what we've seen in the first version is not really reflective, at least for France, of the actual carbon content of the electricity in France. We have a huge problem there. I mean, Luxembourg is really low, France is really high. We don't find what's the source. So maybe, you know, it was a hasty process, and some more work could be done in this regard. We think that if you look at the carbon content of electricity on an hourly basis, in an average way, you can then calculate in a robust way what's the carbon content of hydrogen, have a good life cycle approach as well. So that would already give some confidence to the people like us who want to follow the French hydrogen strategy, which is to have low carbon hydrogen with low carbon electricity. That we have the right definitions, but also the right methodologies on how to know how to calculate. And this is for now not there. And so yes, final investment decisions are not being taken. Then the second point is obviously if you produce this hydrogen, where can it contribute? Where can it contribute in terms of objectives? If I look, for example, okay, let's produce e-fuels for the maritime sector. Am I sure today that this low carbon hydrogen will be accounted when it comes to the emission reduction targets which are being set for the maritime sector? At this stage of the negotiations, I'm not sure, because the wording is not very clear. There was a priority for that maybe only renewable hydrogen and fuels could contribute. So here there is a bit of unclarity. Transport and industry. Well, for now we have the RFNBO targets in the renewable directive, but I think a number of member states are starting to ask the question. There was this letter sent yesterday to the Commission on the occasion of the Energy Council. Why could we not give the option to member states maybe up to a certain level to account this low carbon hydrogen clearly defined towards transport and industry objectives, because it's about decarbonizing these sectors in the fastest way as possible. And we could do that, an amendment in the gas package, for example. That's what these 8 member states have proposed yesterday, and I would be, I mean, I kind of guessed the answer, but I would be really happy to hear your feedback on that. And I think having this more open approach, which we have tested with, I don't know what's your view, but with a number of big federations and industrial players. And I think they would be in favor, because there is really this question about the volumes and what will be available to decarbonize and when. So how could we progress in this direction to get a bit more of an open approach, always sticking to, you know, very strict emission standards, of course, which is always the first step there. So I would stop here.
Thanks a lot, Mario. Thanks a lot. I think that we have already some good, let's say, point to be discussed with all the panelists. So this more open approach, which could be, let's say, quite important to create the market, because obviously when you start, and I refer to my, let's say, experience on the field, when you start an installation, you need to be sure to have the feed and the fuel 24 a day in the industry. And it is quite important, I mean, to have the possibility to cover, let's say, your, let's say, time of production. So it's quite interesting that normally when we started in some some innovation, we were, let's say, more flexible in order to, let's say, get a lot of return from our experience and to stabilize the technology. And then after, we were more rigid on the feed and on the fuel. Because, I mean, in this, let's say, demo or, let's say, period of test, you really need to test the technology. So I work with the steel industry in those, let's say, time, and yes, there is some solution, but we will need at least 3 or 5 years of, let's say, really running the plant and make the plant be, let's say, the best of heart, in order to be competitive enough. So this period is maybe one of the period where we need a lot of openness, guidance, I mean, to support this startup, let's say, new technology. So I will ask Luc now to give his vision of what is missing.
Yeah, I'll maybe start by correcting kind of the intro of how Yara was introduced. So we were introduced as a very large hydrogen consumer. But actually, yeah, we are not a consumer, we're a producer and we're a manufacturer. So yes, we manufacture fertilizers, we manufacture environmental solutions for emission abatement, and we're really looking into clean ammonia as a shipping fuel as our next big business opportunity. We are a sizable manufacturer, because I yesterday compared against the Hydrogen Observatory figures with our own figures, and so it turned out to be 7% that we produce. And it's, of course, gray hydrogen today. But until 1991, we had 135 megawatts of electrolysis operating, making green renewable fertilizer. So it's, yeah, so maybe first of all, it's not, how to say, about innovation. It's not something completely novel. We know how to handle hydrogen. We know how to turn it into our products. And then to say, okay, what is our view on this technology neutrality question? So yes, we are technology neutral, but we are not, let's say, agnostic. We're really looking at the projects that we have, and we try to understand what is feasible and what is the most realistic, and what is there then the, and we are completely open. So carbon capture sequestration, fine. Renewables is okay. Nuclear, we have no, let's say, ideological or moral objections against it as a company. Yes, we follow the societal debate, but as a company, we don't have views on that. We are open to hydrogen grids, where we then are partially indeed an off-taker. And we're, of course, looking very much into the option of importing, because we have almost a similar volume installed outside Europe. So we are really open to that. But then we look at the reality of a project. So first of all, the abatement potential is really important. We are committed to our investors to really reach 2030, 2040, 2050 targets. And there, the timing aspect is really critical. That's really the big benefit of blue hydrogen. We can move very fast. We can even do not low carbon hydrogen, but at least 60% reduction on commercial basis with the ETS system. And we just need to keep that pace to make sure we reach our own decarbonization targets by 2030. We are also looking into, of course, going large scale again in Norway. We're going small scale next year, but we want to go large scale again. And there it's because we can rely on the electricity grid, which in many other locations, even 2030 is still very ambitious. And that's, of course, where French low carbon hydrogen can have a high potential. But then getting and in the hydrogen grids, at the moment, we're actually a bit in the reverse situation. We're kind of seen as the one who will stabilize the grid. So there will be injection of hydrogen on a variable basis. And then we have to make sure that there is constant hydrogen in the grid for the off-takers, because we are then in that area the largest producer. So it's a bit a reverse situation than what's actually desirable. But so then to get back to, let's say, my opening remark, our biggest concern is the other stakeholder that we have, except the shareholders, which are our customers or consumers. At the moment, on the demand side, there is, in our traditional applications, nearly no demand for renewable products. Yes, they are aware of the climate footprint more and more, although I guess I would challenge anybody in this room to say what is the climate footprint of bread and what's the role of our products in that climate footprint. But still, there is this awareness from customers, just like they're aware of organics, that there needs to be this reduction in footprint. At the moment, except one cooperative in Sweden, we don't have this explicit ask for renewable products. And so we see the need to build that value chain, just like it has happened, for example, on biofuels, where it happens in the recycling business. We need to build a value chain because hydrogen is not consumed. It's used for manufacturing. And so if we want to really accelerate, as Europe, this renewable transition, which as Yara, we only see as a solution indeed for 2050. So we are taking this absolutely seriously, and we will invest in it. But we see that only as economic if there is really this demand for renewable goods. What's the alternative? The alternative is basically that European production is forced to operate on initially more expensive renewable electricity. And then, since it's a completely open market, except for carbon prices, CBAM is now at least closing that loophole. It's a completely open market. Then we see that being replaced by imported gray products, which pay a carbon tax, or CCS products. And then we can go into the IRA discussion in the US, where that's now very advantageous. So that's kind of our view. We think that stopping at hydrogen itself in developing this value chain is a fundamental error to make it move. But at the same time, when it comes to neutrality, we just need to keep this pace on decarbonization. And for that, we need to keep all options on the table.
Practically speaking, Luc, if I understand well, I mean, there is no demand for the let's say renewable goods or for the green goods, except for the RFNBO, or except for those who are really well, let's say, defined. So your request is maybe to have green certification for all those products, which could be, let's say, introduced in the market and having the possibility to create the demand.
That is made with renewable energy, and then it doesn't need to be renewable hydrogen. It can even be renewable electricity, because that's a fundament.
Okay.
But this distinction to make it competitive and to make it visible to our customers is really important.
But it will cost, so you need to have the CBAM also.
We are supportive of CBAM. We see that as something that will make CCS blue hydrogen really take off. both on the import side, but also within Europe, because it's attractive and it allows to drive up the carbon price as well. But it's not enough to make the renewable energy directive a success. Therefore, there you need other measures.
Okay. And by the way, because you are, let's say, in the fertilizer industry, do you have green plant in, let's say, starting in Europe about green, let's say, green fertilizer?
Yes, so as Yara, we are starting next year producing again. So we did until 91 and we're now back to the future. And our competitor Fertiberia will be slightly ahead of us or at about the same time, we will see. But yes, this green fertilizer production is again starting, but it's at a small scale compared to the potential in the market. Our project, for example, in the Netherlands to do carbon capture and sequestration is much larger. There we're talking about 800,000 tons of CO2 sequestered per year. That's really making a difference also on the Dutch national statistics. And that's so for 2025, and that's at a completely different scale.
But it is not low carbon, let's say, fertilizer.
No, it's initially not low carbon, but of course, if we are at the 65% investing in the 70%, if there is demand for low carbon goods, it becomes much more attractive.
Okay.
And so the project that we have in Norway, so it's 24 megawatt, and we want to go to 400 megawatts if all the, let's say, funding conditions and the market is in place. And at the moment, we're looking both at the shipping market and our traditional markets. And that would then, as CO2 abatement, be roughly the same, again, in the order of the 800,000 tons of CO2. So these are really, big opportunities actually to reduce our industrial footprint.
Good. Thanks for those good news. And good, let's say, all my congratulations when we will have the green fertilizer, because we need fertilizer, if I understand well, in Europe. Okay, thanks a lot, Luc. Esther, what is your view with your experience?
Yes, thanks a lot for inviting me here to this interesting debate. Really appreciate that. I'm not sure, Antonio, but I had some slides.
Yeah, I can share it.
Them up.
Yeah, 1 second. There we go. Yeah.
So just a quick presentation from my side. So Climate Action Network Europe, doing the gas coordination. CAN Europe is an European Secretariat of EU NGOs working on climate and energy. So we have more than 1,800 member organizations and represent 47 million people across the EU. So a significant share of European civil society. If we go to the next slide, just as sort of an introduction, I mean, many things have been said which resonate also with what, I mean, obviously with what we are doing. So we developed an energy system scenario a couple of years ago, which we are in the course also of revising. But just to give you a bit of an understanding where we think we need to be in 2050 or even earlier, if we are to respect the Paris Agreement, if we are to go towards climate neutrality, which is what the EU policies are about a lot these days, right? So to be in line with one limiting temperature increase to 1.5, we say that we need to achieve climate neutrality already by 2040, not 2050. So we are a decade ahead. And for this to happen, we need to have a very quick ramp up of energy demand reduction. It's also a lot about reducing energy demands, and we need to have a very quick ramp up of renewable energy. And this is also where I hear a lot of sort of synergies of what the Commission is looking at. So, but to sort of give a bit of an idea of the scale of the ambition is that we have to cut energy demand by 2. I mean, we have to halve energy demand by 2050, 2040, even earlier, and that we are and that we have to have this very quick change in terms of the energy mix. So if we go to the next slide, we see more specifically what that means for hydrogen. It means that we have almost a fifth. So I think we are a bit even beyond the Commission's maybe projections, but we have a fifth of the final energy demand, which comes from hydrogen and used in different sectors across mainly for transport, so long distance transport, liquid synthetic fuels, ammonia in shipping, and then a lot in the industry sector, mainly energy intensive sectors such as steel and chemicals. And that you can see that the ramp up comes early as well. I mean, it comes in the 2020s, 2025, 2030. We are already going up very high, and that is because we say, okay, we need to get out of fossils if we are to respect climate neutrality. So that's just a bit of setting the scene. We are also completely aware that today hydrogen production comes mainly from fossil fuels, from steam methane reformation. We are completely aware of that, and that we only have 0.1% coming from renewable electricity, electrolysis based on renewable electricity. But all of that is like additional reasons why we need to have that ramp up and incentives on every level in many different key pieces of the EU legislation to push up renewable electricity generation for first of all, I mean, we want to electrify our sectors, we want to electrify transport, we want to electrify buildings, heating in buildings, and we want to have hydrogen. We see a big role for, I mean, we see clearly a role for gaseous fuels and hydrogen in the energy system, but we need to have additional renewable electricity generation for that also in the future. So the incentives, we need to have the incentives. We need to have clear definitions of low carbon. This brings us to the low carbon role. What is the role of low carbon hydrogen or gases in the future energy mix? And we have a bit of a window. I mean, not a window, but we have a window of 10 years where those low carbon gases still may play a role to a certain extent. But the priority clearly is to get to bring them down and to get renewable-based hydrogen in. That requires clear definitions of low carbon and requires very strong incentives for green hydrogen, renewable-based hydrogen. We can go to the next slide. So setting the context. Basically, where is this going to happen? It has been mentioned to some extent already. I may go to a bit more of detail, I think, on that definition. So we have the European strategy, the hydrogen strategy. It was interesting to hear from you, Ruud, that you never talk about the hydrogen economy. I mean, I take it completely, so that's good. I put it in the slide, but good to see that that's actually, I mean, that's not necessarily how you see it. I think we have, we agree from that perspective that we will have very specific hydrogen clusters, which will be linked to hydrogen production hotspots, places where you can produce and then basically renewable hydrogen, and which you can link then to consumption spots, which are geographically linked, and that's where we go into that hydrogen valley and hydrogen cluster approach. The gas package. So what is low carbon? What does low carbon mean? And where is that going to be discussed? It's clearly the gas package where we have an anchor for that, an anchor for that. And that is really in full speed discussion, right? That's happening now. The gas package is being discussed between the Parliament and the Council just as we speak. Discussions around Article 8 definition of what low carbon is happening now. And I think we have to be very strong in introducing strong criteria. The American, the US Inflation Reduction Act has been mentioned. It talks about life cycle emissions of low carbon or of gases. And in this case, we really need to take into account what is the full life cycle of a low carbon gas, and where are the emissions happening, not only when the gas is being burned, but it starts at the extraction production stage, it goes over the transmission stage, storage, compressors, you have methane leakages basically, and we all know that that's a very potent greenhouse gas, even more potent than CO2. So that clearly needs to be taken into account, and for the time being, it's still quite vague. We talked about blue hydrogen. We can maybe go to the next slide, because I'm already even the next as well, which comes maybe summarizes a bit that life cycle approach and the different elements that we need to include in the definition. So we talked about blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen, yeah, is steam methane reformation with CCS. CCS, yes, but still also needs to be. We don't have so many working experiences or working examples of how it is really functioning, and we need to have very specifically also take into account carbon capture rates. And the efficiency of that process, because it's again another energy intensive or an energy related process. It's going to emit emissions as well, and those need to be taken into account there as well. So the delegated act on low carbon is really one place where those things need to be clarified very, very, very strictly and need to be laid down very clearly. Full LCA. Carbon capture rates, very, very ambitious carbon capture rates, and methane leakage across the supply chain. We also talked about percentages. So we've got the fossil fuel comparator coming from the renewables directive. That's sort of the threshold which is given and which we have already in other pieces of legislation. And in other legislation, such as TENI, for instance, a 70% reduction factor or 70% reduction compared to that threshold has been proposed. And we see on this slide what that means in terms of the different production pathways for different types of hydrogen. So 70% is a pink dotted line, and basically it leaves a space for electrolysis from renewable hydrogen. It leaves a space for blue hydrogen, but only if there's very strong carbon capture rates included. We are so this is information from Agora. The ICCT is the International Clean Transport Council for Transportation, has been looking into this also in very much detail, and we say that we need to push that that percentage even further down to be sure that we have a very strict sort of definition for what types of low carbon gases may play a role over the next 10 years, and to give on the other side the incentive for renewable based hydrogen to be pushed up further. And this brings me then to the second part of a piece of legislation, which has been discussed, and we can go back again maybe, and no, we go down, sorry, that's the last slide which is going to come, not this one. It's basically the same as we had just before. Yeah, voila. So where are we going to bring more clarity about what is that renewable-based hydrogen how do we want to ramp up that renewables-based hydrogen? It's a REPowerEU delegated act, you all know it. It's been in the making over the last 2 years. It's a difficult process. We want to see it, we really want to get it out, as it brings more clarity around how this how the renewable hydrogen can be produced, and what are sort of the clear boundaries in terms of timing. So we've got, for the time being, a transition period until 27, grandfathering clause for any electrolyzer which goes on the grid after that, but with a 10-year sunset clause. So after that, every electrolyzer which has gone on the grid before 27, needs to come in with additionality. It needs to come in with additional generation capacities. This is something which is safeguarding the additionality, which I mentioned previously, which is key to ensure that we have the ramp up of the generation capacities that we need to go previously in. I mean, firstly, electrify the economy, electrify sectors, and on top of that, also being able to produce hydrogen from renewable electricity. So additionality is a key principle that we need to safeguard. And we have it in the delegated acts. We would probably not have seen such a long sunset. I mean, sunset clause over 10 years, but I think this is, given the current discussions that also happened in the Parliament, this is a way forward that gives at least some clarity, visibility, and also steers into the right direction. And then, yeah, the incentives, obviously, for all of this to happen, we need to have incentives, and we need to be, we need to see a shift from the different EU funding sources that are available. You mentioned some, be it the RF, be it on the state aid. I mean, state aid is a tricky bit, one, because for the time being, we have no definition of low carbon, so we don't know what it is. And it is not channeling, from that point of view, it's not channeling necessarily into that sort of priority direction that we need to see. Another reason why this is so important to get it out quickly and not sort of get it into another legislative loop and cycle of 2 years if we need to integrate it into RED 3 and co-decision and so on. Voilà. So we do see some clearly some need, some urgent need, then for supporting new generation capacities that need to be coupled, that are coupled then to some priority sectors. I think roughly on the same line with the Commission that we see priority sectors in transport and in energy intensive industry. So we could imagine contracts for different type of support scheme for the steel and the chemical sector, for instance. Voilà, I leave it at that. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you. I mean, I think that you have a convergence of clarification with Marion and with Luc. So there is now there is a strong request, I mean, to get all those definitions. I mean, that's, I mean, and I know it's not easy because, I mean, I know that you did some proposal and there is still some discussion on that. But let's say on the field, they need the definition are needed, but that is quite important. So now that we have seen, let's say, these aspects, I would like to go back to France and with France Hydrogen and with Simon Pujol, because I think that you had work on that and you want to deliver, but there are some barriers.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this kind invitation. So I will talk for France Hydrogen, the French Hydrogen Industry Association, so the collective view of the French hydrogen industry. And I insist on this collective dimension because, of course, in France, we have stakeholders directly involved in the low carbon hydrogen, notably EDF, not to quote them, but also pure players of renewable and renewable hydrogen. And there is this common recognition between low carbon and renewable players, including pure players of renewable, that renewable and low carbon hydrogen don't compete. They complete each other and they need to get an equal treatment so that all the hydrogen production and hydrogen use be able to achieve the ambition, the related ambition, which is legitimate and which has been very well set by the European Commission. And thank you for that. So about this ambition, I heard what you said, Mr. Kempener, about the fact that the 50% target of RFNBO in industry will be achievable and that there will be a level playing field by 2030 for other kinds of low carbon hydrogen. To complete that, I would like to, I really would wish, but as Marion said, with this figure about the the few final investment decision, only 10% which are made currently, we see there is a gap between what was initially planned, and we always to tend towards this high decarbonization and what is really done at the moment. So about your slide on the different tools we have in the European legislation, there was one which is not technology neutral, the RED III, with the target, and specifically we think it's at the core of everything. The target of 50% in industry and 2.6 or 5.7% in transport sector is high, is legitimate and totally necessary, but will be achievable only with a combination of renewable and low carbon hydrogen. And we must send the right signal by leaving at the discretion of each member state the possibility to open these targets. So why? First, in absolute terms, if we refer to the REPowerEU objective, it's approximately 500 for the 10 megaton of domestic production. Of course, it's approximately 550 terawatt hours of electricity. It's huge. I'm convinced that renewable will be probably the key pillar of decarbonization and at the scale of the EU, and decarbonization with hydrogen, but it's not necessarily sufficient by 2030. So 550 terawatt hour in absolute terms, yes, it's huge. It represents approximately 420 gigawatt of new dedicated solar capacities if we refer to only one energy source, or 165 gigawatt of offshore wind new dedicated capacities. And we firmly think to the complementarity of all these technologies, renewable and low carbon, to achieve this ambition. Then beyond the absolute terms, at the scale of the Union, we think target must be adapted to all the territory and diversity. It was very well written and set in the European hydrogen strategy. The goal is to have hydrogen use in industry, in transport, also relevant segments within the whole European Union. Well, today, within the European Union, we have very diverse energy system, and so we must adapt the decarbonization goal. We must let the possibility to member states to achieve the decarbonization goals with their specific characteristic of their energy system and also political choices, which are legitimate. So yes, there is this adaptation to all the territories within the EU, and also 2030 is tomorrow, but we don't have to refer only to 2030. It's what happens now, which projects are launched. We said it, only 10% of final investment decision. It's too little. Each ton counts. We have to make a very swift launch of the hydrogen project, and an exception of very ambitious hydrogen project has been launched in Sweden. I'm not patriot, I take another country. It's hybrid and very well supported by the Innovation Fund and the European Commission. And why did we manage to launch, did they manage to launch this very ambitious project? It was because they relied on a very low carbon electricity grid, which allowed to have a steady supply for the steel industry, which was totally needed. It was an imperative for making this investment and this technological decision. And it's because thanks to their rely on complementarity between renewable and low carbon that they managed to launch a big decarbonization project. Beyond the industry, we also have to launch new use, especially in the transport segment. And we told a lot about the chicken and egg problem in the AFIR regulation. Well, there is a third component in this chicken and egg problem for hydrogen mobility. It's what about the availability of clean hydrogen in the territories? And for having this availability in some territories of the Union, not all of them, the recognition of low carbon hydrogen and its contribution to the decarbonization targets is totally imperative. And today it stuck projects not to have this this acknowledgement. I told about complementarity, and I would like to illustrate that with the collective reflection and thinking we have in France, in France Hydrogen, so collectively at the level of the French hydrogen industry. A lot of our projects in the pipe in France in world transparency or connect electrolyzers, which will be connected to the grid and will be able to have a very high load factor thanks to our low carbon electricity grid. But because we are able to deliver massive amounts of clean hydrogen, a part renewable, a part low carbon, we are thinking collectively to launch, to develop off-grid system of hydrogen, specifically to be able to use renewable energies that will not be developed otherwise, because connection problems with the grid, too many delays or costs, and so hydrogen is often seen physically it's fair as something which will consume a lot of electricity, a lot of energy. We think it's something else, and I know the Commission agrees with us. It's a very strategic tool to accelerate on renewable energies. And because we have this massive amount of low carbon hydrogen on one side, we are able to use the potential of grid energies to develop new capacities of renewable energy with electrolyzers below to use these capacities which will not be exploited otherwise. Finally, we have very big ambition on electrolysis capacities, which are very well supported by the Commission, and we come back to the need of swift launch of the project. It's good that the industry, the manufacturers be supported by the European Commission, but what they need most is a swift launch of the orders, and these orders will be done by renewable players and by low carbon hydrogen players. So yes, there is this need to open the targets for this also. And finally, I would like to come back on the view of the delegated act presented by Esther. We are quite close. I would like to underline that France Hydrogen is part of the industry stakeholders which were most supportive of the European Commission view. We asked a little bit more flexibilities than the one you presented, but it was quite close. And why did we get this view, this, I think, right compromise between need of flexibilities to take off the industry and to keep a carbon methodology which be strict? It's because we are able to rely on both, on low carbon hydrogen and on renewable hydrogen, which are complementaries. And thanks to that, we keep our only focus, which is the reduction of the emission.
Thank you, Sam. So you are pleased with the additionality, which is one of very acceptable, innovative position, because I mean, you have low carbon.
It's not the additionality where we can have divergence on.
I'm sure that you remember you have some discussion internally.
Yes, very intense discussion, but yes, we stood for a derogation on additionality until 2030 and a grandfathering clause for this project, which enter into service for 2030.
But you know, I often heard during our discussion that the fact regarding additionality is important, because I mean, it's clearly to not create or to not increase the emission at the end, because I mean, that was maybe one of the first, let's say, argument from our colleague from the NGO and all the stuff, all those people who are really, let's say, willing to decrease the emissions. So the additionality is one of these key elements. But if we have this additionality, we need to have something else. So it's the reason why maybe you have this dual aspect. Yes, maybe you could have a pure product with a strong additionality, but for the operation, you need another one which will complement that, if I understand your.
Yes, typically in France, and today projects are stuck partly because of the confusion about how low carbon hydrogen will be recognized, but a huge industry stakeholder user could plan a project of electrolyzers connected to the grid. Well, about 24 months for the development of these electrolyzers. They will be able, after this 24 months, to rely on the low carbon electricity grid. But in the same time, this industry stakeholder could invest in another power plant, which be close of the industry or more far, but by PPA, we can join, we can connect. Just it will take more time to be developed, this photovoltaic or wind power plant. And so both are totally complementary. It's just, it allows low carbon hydrogen in some specific case. Sweden and France allow to launch projects very quickly. And in the same time, we develop renewable on our territory.
Good, good. So I'm sure that you will have some answer to this. Arthur, you are, let's say, on the renewable hydrogen coming from the solar electricity. What is your view on that? I mean, are you satisfied with all these priority on renewable? I'm sure that you are satisfied. Now, practically speaking, what are the issues that you see on that?
Yeah, I'm sure that the feeling that we give to the commission is that we're never satisfied. That's our job. But yeah, it's going in the right direction overall. Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me here. It's really nice. I'm really learning a lot from hearing from all of you, especially talking about low carbon hydrogen. Thank you for the invitation. And I think as part of the renewables world, we really need to get into the conversation with everybody else, make sure that this hydrogen world does not just become a new gas world, a new world of the old gas sectors, and that if we produce renewable hydrogen, which is our goal, it's actually produced by the renewable electricity sector. Yeah, so we are involved a lot in renewable hydrogen with Wind Europe. And Breakthrough Energy, we created the Renewable Hydrogen Coalition, which is kind of the operational arm of our actions on hydrogen. I think it's really important that the voice of the renewables is heard in the hydrogen debate for the same reasons. Now we're talking about technology neutrality. It's, and again, not a debate which we intervene a lot of the time, but we like it. We like the focus on technology neutrality. But just to focus on one aspect of it, decarbonization is not the only factor that we should be taking into account here. I heard that this should be the only thing we should take into account. I deeply disagree with that. I think go to climate neutrality and overall environmental transition is more than emitting less. And so if you take technology neutrality and you take objective criteria, you might take, okay, so how do we use cheap source of electricity, or energy in general? How do we use an energy source that is swiftly scalable, that is inexhaustible, that is fully decarbonized? Well, even with taking those criteria, you end up with the same response, renewables. So I think that is why, I mean, this may be a hint as to why the European Commission has technology-specific approach, especially on the renewables, the Renewable Energy Directive, and all that comes with it. So, I mean, for example, with solar based hydrogen, you can go down to maybe 1 gram of CO2. So this is lower. So if you take technology neutral criteria, especially on GHG emission, well, sure, let's make other sources of hydrogen, apply the same kind of strict criteria that we have for renewables and the same levels of emission. This was just that. Now to answer the bit of the questions that I see here on the paper, I see first, is it possible to ramp up our hydrogen economy without the contribution of low carbon? So to answer that, you know, I kind of prepared this a little bit. I went down to my notes, I put my head down and I went straight into this question. I was like, okay, I presented my numbers one time already in this roundtable. Let's do that again. So yes, we have very high ambitions. We think in a business as usual scenario, We can go up to 700 gigawatts capacity of solar in Europe as a whole. If you add so that's DC numbers, if you add the wind, we should be able to get to a 50% renewables in the energy mix in Europe, which is amazing. There's a lot of work to do, of course, on our part to achieve that target. And so if you get to the numbers in the end, you may end up with 20% of that electricity from renewables ending up in electrolysis. And that is to reach the target. So if we just go down to the numbers and those ambitions, it is possible to reach those renewables targets and renewable hydrogen target only with renewables. That is, if I go down to my notes and look at the numbers. Now I put my head up again and I think, okay, what was the question again? How do we ramp up a hydrogen economy without the contribution of low carbon hydrogen? I think the question is wrong. And I think we shouldn't be asking, and I think that also bounces off what the Hood said. We shouldn't be thinking first, how do we ramp up a hydrogen economy at all costs, whatever it costs? We should be thinking, how do we decarbonize all our sectors? And then the question of hydrogen comes in. That means that the immense majority of the gas that we use today will be replaced by electrification. Now, there are some sectors where, of course, hydrogen is used as a feedstock, it's already used, and some sectors where the temperature that needs to be reached cannot be decarbonized other than with renewable hydrogen. And so it needs to go there. But if we cannot reach that target with the right technology, let's not replace that target by filling up some other technologies that do not meet our criteria. Let's ramp up the right technologies that will allow us to go there only. That was just to answer the first question. Now, we need to differentiate a little bit the definition, the work on the definition, and the work on the incentives, I think. The work on the definitions, yeah, we need maybe technology neutral definitions. And so in that effect, you need to reach a 70% reduction that is pointing to a 3.3, 3.4 grams of CO2. And that is equal for renewables and for other low carbon hydrogen technologies. So how do you do that with the renewables? I think the additionality criteria can be quite strict and if respected, should enable us to produce a lot less GHG emission with renewables. But now for low carbon, how do you reach that? And I'm thinking here of the fossil options. Well, sure, let's define it as low carbon if it can actually reach the criteria for low carbon. How do you do that? Again, and to come to Esther's point a little bit also, the ICCT has done a very good job of that. AGOA has done a very good job of that. And let's take those numbers. You cannot reach the 70% reduction without excellent carbon capture rates, because without that, it's just a gray hydrogen project. So let's reach those 83.5% of carbon capture rate. It's also making sure that there's no methane emissions in the production. And so it needs to be below 0.2% of methane leakages there. Otherwise, you have methane into the air. And I don't think we can live with methane emissions in a climate neutral economy. So those are just some of the criteria. We need a technology neutral approach for the definition. But of course, how do you evaluate those emissions in each technology? Well, you need a soundproof methodology for that, and that includes different criteria for each technology. So it is a technology neutral approach. It is very strict, and I agree to that. And now I saw on the screen in your introductory presentation an outrageous proposal, which was to expand the definition of renewable energy at least in the beginning or something, to make sure that we attain our objectives. Again, it is going completely contrary to our objectives. And putting a green label on something that is not green is just, it would be a huge defeat for Europe. And it's definitely not our objective. So let's define what every technology is, how it can contribute to our transition. And then with those in mind, set some targets and some incentives. So yes, of course, we need the binding targets, for ambitious binding targets for the take-up of renewable hydrogen. That is something that can be swiftly scaled at European level. But if we think of incentives, should we really use public money and have incentives in terms of binding targets for the take-up of technologies that basically increase the imports of fossil fuels from Russia? Maybe I cannot comment on that because it's not my sector, but it seems a bit complicated to do that from our point of view. So of course, if it can contribute in the very short term, it should be done and defined correctly, it should be okay. But putting targets for anything else than the technologies that actually help us in the long term, for us, it sounds a little bit difficult.
Okay, Arthur. May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
The topic of the of this event was incentive. There is a strong and clear target in the taxonomy, 3.4 kilo of CO2 per kilo of hydrogen. So that was, let's say, defined on the taxonomy. And the taxonomy is a mechanism which is used to, let's say, attract the financing of the project, the private financing, not the public one, but at least, I mean, it is based on that. Why we have a specific treatment for the public money in this case, and why is not this as simple as it is? If you have a project which is, let's say, emitting less than 3.4 kilo, why should not be incentivized by the public money?
So I think there's two answers to that. One of them I gave hints at is that yes, there are carbon emissions, but there's also other aspects, and one of them is maybe that we're going to have to limit our imports of fossil fuels, even if in you limit the emissions they produce and you put it into the ground, being a bit more autonomous on that aspect, especially as we see the volatility of this market. I think is one of the very strong arguments in favor of that. And secondly, let's not, lock ourselves up in sort of short-term, medium-term solutions, which require totally different type of assets from the ones that need us to get to the 2050 targets. And so, of course, technology neutrality is good for the short term, maybe, and again, with assets that already exist. But if they do not help us get to climate neutrality by 2050, I do not see how we can use public money to fund that.
Okay, but 3.4 tons or kilo of CO2 per kilo of hydrogen was something which cover also the electricity produced by solar panel. So, I mean, when you see the complete life cycle, you arrive to the conclusion that you need to have at least 3 kilo to cover your solar production. So in this case, yes, I mean, I'm sure that renewable will be the future. Is it the future? Because I mean, we have the access to that, and it's quite important. But I don't understand why you give the possibility to be sustainable for the private industry and not for the public one. I mean, there is a taxonomy, there is a sustainable finance, there is something which is, let's say, created to attract all the private money, and the private money is needed, I mean, to ramp up all those technology. Why, if we have a mechanism which is not renewable, fine. I mean, you have a sticker which is renewable because it's better and it will be long term. But in this case, it is maybe low carbon hydrogen using, let's say, biomass, or let's say using nuclear, or using, let's say, other technology that I don't know, emitting less than 3.4 kilo per kilo of hydrogen. Why should we not give a support to that?
Maybe I can respond.
I'm sure because it was an opening. It's like the rugby. I mean,
Yeah, throw a ball.
Right, you have
So may I also take the opportunity to see what I've kind of learned here at the same time. So I think we have, I think nobody disagreed that we need to have certification for renewable and low carbon hydrogen. And I think that's also from us really important that we have, and that was in the hydrogen strategy. We need to have renewable, low carbon, and grey hydrogen, and these need to be separately. And the delegated acts are an important element of that. There's nobody else in the world who would like to have that delegated act out more than I do. I can absolutely assure you of that. But you know how political it has been, and I'm praying that we are very, very, very close. Any issues that there are now with the delegated act, for example, Marion mentioned the CO2 intensity of the French electricity mix. These are technical issues. I mean, we're discussing with the Joint Research Center, with the people from the French government, what are the methodologies? These are just technical issues. It's not political. No. I think we're fully online there. We need to have the right methodology. So I think that's what we agree with. Now, in the hydrogen strategy in 2020, and let's face it, we have a really dynamic energy world today. I'm disappointed that there's still the perception that there's not sufficient clarity on how the hydrogen strategy has been translated into the policy proposals, because that has been one of my jobs. So I failed, and that the hydrogen strategy essentially was breaking down all of this, the development of hydrogen into certain segments: production, infrastructure, demand, international cooperation, research and innovation. We haven't really talked about that, but those are the 5 specific sectors. And what the hydrogen strategy did is that, like, on the production side, we are energy source neutral. So, you know, whenever a product is low carbon, under the EU ETS, if you're below the threshold, you get free allowances. Under the taxonomy, if you're under the tree, you for private sector financing. Under the state aid, the RRF, etc., the IPCEI, yes, we don't have the definition of low carbon hydrogen yet, but they all cover renewable and low carbon hydrogen. That's the production side. Infrastructure side. Again, we're saying we need to have hydrogen pipelines. That's what the big discussion is about. Who puts whatever hydrogen in there? Perfectly fine, but you need to have renewable and low carbon hydrogen in there. That's where the definition comes again. Again, we have this energy source neutrality on the infrastructure. Now, then we come to the demand. There, the demand targets are indeed specific for renewable hydrogen. And they be defined in such a way already in 2020 that on the one hand side, we said we have existing assets. Can we use the existing assets to decarbonize low hydrogen before 2030? If so, we should do it. Try to do it as much as possible, because grey hydrogen is still responsible, and now I say 4%, but I'm not 100% sure, but of CO2 emissions. So that's an absolute imperative before 2030. But we also need new. And what is new is renewable hydrogen produced by additional renewable electricity. And that's where the target comes from. We're not only adding a decarbonized hydrogen source to our energy system, we're actually adding this 333 or 550 terawatt hours of additional clean electricity to the system. Because without that, we not only have problems in terms of the CO2 emissions, because you might produce hydrogen at those times where your system is running on fossil fuels, but you have issues with electricity prices, because these targets mean indeed 15% of electricity consumption going to hydrogen. And you also have security issues, especially in the REPowerEU. So there's a very kind of specific reasons why we have this 50%. It doesn't say there's no space for low carbon hydrogen, but we say we need this because there are these 3 political reasons. And then the 4th one, very clear, the long-term perspective. Any investment what we do today will be there for 20 years. So I think that's been the idea. I think that's what has been translated into all of the policy packages. of course, everyone is eagerly waiting for that to finish, and I think we're getting close this year. You know, we might need a couple more months, but I think then the framework is there. And then all of the questions which we have here about talking about energy source neutrality, essentially, in my opinion, have been answered. We have the production, which can be renewable or another source, as long as it leads to decarbonization. We have infrastructure which should be able to take renewable or low carbon hydrogen, but then on the demand side, we on the one hand side need to have, and that's where the production comes from, the decarbonization of existing assets, but then we need an additional boost, an additional incentive to get all of that new, not only hydrogen in place because it's the carrier, but also the new decarbonized electricity energy sources in place, and that's the renewable hydrogen.
And for the decarbonization of the, let's say, current consumption, the incentive will be the ETS, the carbon price.
There's more than that. So we have the EU ETS, of
Yeah.
course. There previously steam methane reforming plants were the only ones which were eligible under the EU ETS. That has been expanded.
Yeah.
So any production facility at scale falls under the EU ETS. If you're below the benchmark, which is about 6, I think, kilos of CO2 per kilowatt, you're below that, you get free allowances. So that on the one hand side, yeah. We haven't even talked about the energy taxation directive as well. Then you have the state aid and the RF, which are both eligible for renewable and low carbon hydrogen. Let's have those definitions out there, then we can use it. But that again is also available there. We have the recovery and resilience funds. Again, there, it's both covered. Of course, we're waiting for the definition, but it's covered there as well. So I think the framework as such is still consistent. So if you like the hydrogen strategy, then at least the implementation of that has been consistent with it.
In the low carbon, you have those 3 mechanisms that you mentioned. By the way, on the state aid, you have the carbon contract for difference.
So no, actually, the new state aid allows carbon contracts for difference. That's indeed the case. But we're now looking, of course, on the innovation fund as the first mechanism to do this at a European level. And there we are looking at 2 different bits. Now, on the one hand side, the innovation fund, and that's also our executive vice president refers to. We can actually start using it for contracts for difference. So the difference is there is subtle, it's not subtle, but a carbon contract for difference is really for the end consumer.
Yeah.
Or a contract for difference can be specific for a carrier or a source. So what we're looking there right now is, can we use the innovation fund, of course, once the trilogues have been concluded, to have a specific call for hydrogen coming into the system way before 2030. Because we have the 2030 targets for the demand. We have the 2030 ambitions to have, all of this decarbonized hydrogen coming into play. But what we want to do now, especially in a situation where gas is very, very scarce, to also have a goal to get much more renewables into the system to meet those 2027 ambitions of getting rid of the Russian gas.
Okay. And what about the maritime proposal then?
So the maritime proposal in the Fit for 55 package was based on greenhouse gas emission reductions. So whatever the different kind of sources could you use that, you have to reduce greenhouse gas emission reductions. Now, I understand in the parliament, they've now introduced separate sub-targets for renewable hydrogen fuels. Indeed, I think if you look at the sub-targets, we need much more than the sub-targets. I think I would see these as minimums. Place. The same for the aviation sector. Our proposal is to reduce emissions in the aviation sector. The target that we had there for renewable hydrogen is really 0.7%. It's very small, but it's really to kickstart that particular production pathway there. So the targets which are in there, well, at least for the aviation, have been very, very small. But of course, the incentive as a whole for both those end-use sectors is, of course, to decarbonize them as soon as possible.
But so Commission's view on maritime is that all types of fuels should be able to contribute to decarbonization objectives of maritime based on certifying the emission reduction.
As you've seen in the proposal indeed, yeah, that was the proposal that we put on the table, yeah.
If I may just come back on the contracts for difference in the innovation fund and state aid. So that's running up from, I mean, that's functional from when onwards, and do we have a low carbon definition by then already in place? So we might be again in a bit of a phase where there is.
I'm hoping there what Marianne refers to, and I think that's very important, that we have some consistency. So yes, we're working on the delegated act for the greenhouse gas emissions, which applies to renewable hydrogen, but it also luckily also applies to recycled carbon fuels. So there are elements in there which can also refer to any decarbonized fuel produced from fossil fuels. So we have the elements in there. We do hope that once we've had this discussion, once we've finalized this, that indeed is the basis for very rapidly also having a delegated act for the greenhouse gas emissions for low carbon hydrogen. And there, I think I actually welcome the council position on that, which has asked us to do it immediately. So I think we have, the delegated act coming in within, and they say, no, once we come with an agreement, you commission, you're locked into an office, and you have to come out with a delegated act straight away because we need it. And I agree with that. I mean, if you look at the investment decisions, we need to have that as soon as possible, because otherwise, with our 2030 objectives, we have very limited time.
But Luc.
Yeah, I have a question about the 2030 objective, because we talk now a lot about the delegated act and the clarity there. But as mentioned, there is also a lot of variability in what member states can do. How can we make sure that member states put policies in place to make the 2030 target possible? Because 2030 is a target where we using that hydrogen. It's not a target where we are starting and signing investment decisions. We are by then supposed to operate. How do we make sure that the member states also have their policy packages in place by then? Not by then, in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there again in the design of especially the Fit for 50 and the Renewable Energy Directive, the target for example the renewable hydrogen industry, it is not 2029, it's not 2028, it's 2030. So in principle, and it's on the member state level. So in principle, an industry which already starts to use hydrogen, but it's not renewable, 2028, 2029, perfectly fine, as long as we meet the target in 2030, making sure that we indeed have that ramp up phase to get there. It was 2021 when we put the proposal forward. We're now in 2022. So we hope that 8 years will at least have a sufficient kind of time horizon in front of us. Now, one of the important elements there is that, of course, next year, the member states have to design their update their national energy and climate plans. And I think that's, we think we're busy now with all of the policy proposals, but that will again be a very busy year, because I think that's crucial to have already then, all of those packages in place, and have then also at the national level, those energy and climate plans aligning to the European targets. And if we have that, if we manage to achieve that, I'm very confident that we're going to get there. And I think, and this is quite, in my opinion, quite weird, is that there's not a lot of discussion about what is happening in the US, and I understand that. But if I try to look from an outsider's perspective, I think we are much further advanced. We're much further advanced than what is happening anywhere else, specifically because we're talking about production, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about demand, we're talking about support scheme. We're having that all in an integrated package.
I'm sure. But I mean, the question that now we have is how to implement this beautiful mechanism. Because I mean, the implementation need to get some clarification, and you gave those clarification, and we need to continue on this debate. I mean, because I mean, we don't know when will arrive all those delegated acts and how they will be built. But if I may, as let's say, taking the let's say the role of those who have to invest, it would be good, I mean, to have from the Commission, let's say, verbatim a guideline of if you have a business plan, okay, fine. You will have a part of your product which will be renewable. I mean, you have an installation which will run on energy source, and you will have a part of product which will be low carbon. Let's say forget all the gray one, because I mean, obviously you are trying to match the 3.4, because you are sustainable. I mean, you are investing in something which is sustainable, even if it's not long term, but it is sustainable. So in this case, a part of this production, which is under the low carbon definition, that this should be certified. And you should, let's say, guarantee that there is a certification, I mean, to identify the renewable one and the low carbon one. And not only in the production of hydrogen, but on all the value chain, because I mean, you have that on the RFNBO, but on the steel one, maybe they will need some certification on that. But a step further, the renewable one will, let's say, have this kind of incentive, which is a demand one. I mean, it's clearly the what I have understood. But for the low carbon production, the incentive is more, let's say, given by the state, if I understand well, because I mean, you have the stated guideline, which could cover some of those low carbon industry. And with that, I will say, okay, fine, I will put my installation in one member state, which will give me the right subsidies or right incentive. So you are organizing a competition between those who have the possibility and all those who have not the possibility. So that brings to another question.
But it's also a question of those who want to have the possibility and how those who don't want to have the possibility. And I think that's consistent with our role of the European Commission again. Some member states, they don't want to produce low carbon hydrogen. Fine, but others, of course, have the resources there and will, I think, into the future will always produce low carbon hydrogen, especially if it is electricity based. And there, I think, for example, the hybrid project, which was mentioned, I think is a very interesting case because they're not producing green steel, and they're also not saying they're producing green steel. They're producing fossil-free steel. That's the product. And if you produce fossil-free steel, of course, what you would need to show us that you're producing fossil-free steel is certificates from any renewable hydrogen that you're consuming, or any certificates of low carbon hydrogen that you can consuming. So I think that's really a perfect example of how this system will work in practice.
The Swedish motors.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fossil-free. That's great, but I think that you were asking why I do not have, let's say, really succeed in communicating that. Maybe because I mean it is first complex, and then we need to have some good example. I mean, in the hybrid production, because the hybrid production will be maybe the production of tomorrow. But wait. Question.
Yes, if I may.
Sure, man, it's a debate.
No, just this is a question that has been bugging us since 2008, actually, since we had the 2020. How do we bridge and connect the renewable part of the decarbonization exercise with the actual decarbonization exercise? And the question is very simple, because we'll be talking about a market that needs to be stimulated from the production point of view and from the consumption point of view, just to give an incentive whatsoever to consumers. So question is very simple. Why are we not still considering on a serious manner the possibility to surrender, because now everything is based mostly on GHG emission reduction. So the surrender of guarantees of origin for green hydrogen tomorrow, or a certification of low carbon hydrogen within the emission trading scheme, meaning the conversion of guarantees of origins and or certification of low carbon hydrogen with EUAs in the ETS, because that would help. Remember the last discussion with the energy intensive saying, yes, but we have a very challenging target on the consumption and industry level. and we do not have the means to have it in place other than having our governments subscribing these targets and then dumping them on us. And that would probably stimulate a market approach, because a union database would be, common language, guarantees of origin. It's like IT, basically, data to fill. So that would be my question. And we can't sleep at night since 2008. So.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, maybe to kind of, I hope for everyone to kind of draw into this discussion, is that we have at the moment two things which are separate systems. One is that we are having guarantees of origins for electricity, which electricity is a network, it's pan-European. So we have these flows around the EU, and they help for information. For information purposes, and that's indeed what kind of was put in place in 2008. You are a consumer, you want to know how much of the electricity is renewables, and that's what kind of the guarantees of origins have been doing so far. Now, in the electricity sector, which you see not in 2008, but started in 2015, are renewable power purchase agreements. And renewable power purchase agreements have now actually become very attractive. And the latest is like we have 8 gigawatts or something like that signed in 2021. We were on track in 2022 to exceed that, where actually the end consumer makes a direct contract with a producer and saying, I have contributed to that renewable power project, and therefore I am assigning that electricity to me. Now, what you see in the EU ETS, but also in the state aid rules, etc., is that becomes kind of the currency which is being used right now at the moment. So if I am at the moment an electricity or an industrial end consumer, and I sign renewable PPAs, then that is clear that is the electricity which I've been kind of put in place within the EU. The same system as the renewable PPAs essentially has been the certification scheme in what we've done in the biofuels. So in the biofuels so far, you didn't have a guarantees of origin system because biofuels cannot be traded in a pipeline across the EU. So you trade it with the flow. The same will happen for hydrogen. We don't have a hydrogen infrastructure. You see, trade the hydrogen with the certificate to the end consumer. Again, there, when you are in industrial and you can hand over that certification scheme, then you can directly say, okay, this hydrogen that I've consumed has a low CO2 emission because I have the certificate. As soon as we get a hydrogen infrastructure, we can go to the next step, because then at that point in time, we have indeed created what is called this union database, where you say, I'm a hydrogen producer of renewable or low carbon hydrogen connected to the infrastructure. I put it into the infrastructure, and any consumer which is connected on that infrastructure can take it. Now that can be traded however it wants to, because it doesn't matter. It's one system, so it doesn't really matter where the hydrogen flows to. So once we have that in place, we indeed go towards a system where you as an end consumer can say, I'm connected to a hydrogen pipeline from someone, doesn't really matter who. I purchase renewable or low carbon hydrogen, and then that I can count towards my accounting, and that has a connection there. So in progress.
But the good news is that the infrastructure is already there. So.
Starting together. Well, yeah.
Yeah, I had a quick question.
Could you describe yourself a little bit?
My name's Emma, and I work with Guidehouse on some of these topics. I wanted to come back to the discussion about using CFDs for the production side, because something that strikes me is comments you articulated that there's not much of a market at the moment. And so I'm curious how the CFD could potentially work there, given that for a strike price, you don't really have a reliable electricity price to leverage. What's the thinking? I'm curious to know more.
We will actually discuss Friday more. But the contracts for difference idea is indeed the ability to kind of help on the one hand side producers to find some off-takers. So yes, this will not be a market in the sense that you have people trading liquid hydrogen contracts, but in effect having an initial situation where at least bilateral contracts are being signed is what those contracts for difference can achieve. Now, contracts for difference can be introduced in a number of different ways, but I would say there are three big categories. One is you have a reference price, indeed, like you refer to, which could be gray hydrogen as an off-taker side. You could also have some kind of index price where maybe you take the electricity or something like that as an index price. So then it's not necessarily linked to where that producer finds an off-taker. And the third element is that actually in the contract for difference, you would request both the producer and off-taker to find each other already. So you're essentially saying you find yourself an off-taker, and the contract for difference will allow you then to kind of cover the cost gap between what the off-taker can pay and the producer can produce. So there are different ways in how those contracts for difference can achieve at least the creation of off-take agreements. Now, that's not necessarily the same as a market where, you know, people are trading that hydrogen over time. But I think that we can only achieve when we have that infrastructure in place. So it will be a step towards it, but of course it can't be the market creator as we see in gas or electricity.
Okay, but it's a sort of a different actual goal than a CFD traditionally is designed for.
I have to, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, do we have another question or do remark or comment? Yes, please.
That's Michiel with ExxonMobil. Fascinating debate. Thank you very much for the invitation. Lots of things we could talk about. Just on the flag that fully agree with what was said on my left-hand side about we have to make sure that we look at the life cycle. Things right, that's absolutely key. The atmosphere doesn't care where the emissions come from; it just cares about the emissions and where the world is now. I think we need all the technologies to be able to compete and to collaborate in order to achieve emission reductions in a way that's affordable, I think. And so the world needs reductions that are fast, that are scalable. One thing to think about in that context is there's a big demand, certainly from an industry perspective, but I think from a transport perspective as well, for renewable electricity and more of it quicker because of the abatement potential that is there. Knowing that I think currently what is at the efficiency of hydrogen production by electrolysis is like 55%. If by 2030 that's a lot of renewable electricity that could find a different and maybe better home at short notice, then pushing it into hydrogen, knowing that there's other alternatives out there. So we are certainly very much for a life cycle approach to this and allowing all technologies to compete. The one thing I wanted to focus on a little bit more is on the competitiveness aspect, because we talked a lot about the production and the demand side, targets into transportation, targets into heating buildings. That's one thing. The thing that's vitally different for industry is, of course, the exposure to competition, the carbon leakage aspect. Which we talk a lot about in the context of ETS and CBAM. Of course, now this proposed new mandate for industry introduces something that's likely going to be a significant cost for EU industry, right? On top of all the other measures on industry today. I have not yet seen a comprehensive proposal on how to deal with those competitiveness aspects. And with everything going on, this is yet an additional nail on the coffin of industry. And I go back to the need, and in the end, that what we need is global emission reductions, right? I mean, Europe continues to have, what, 7 or 8% global emissions. If Europe proves to the rest of the world that, yes, it can decarbonize, but it can only do so by deindustrializing, I don't think the rest of the world will follow, and nobody wins, right? So how do you do this together in a way that keeps a thriving, or that enables industry to be thriving in Europe as you decarbonize? That continues to be a key question that we need to address together, I think.
Okay. I will leave the last word to Ruud, but you open another debate, and I think that we will have the pleasure, I mean, to recreate this debate for the competition. But if you want to add something as an answer, the first answer.
I think it's again, in terms of what we're putting on the table, as is in mine. Because the industry target is not a target on industry. It's a target on the member state to make sure that the industry can do it. And that's a very important difference. Because we absolutely understand, and we all know that both renewable and low carbon hydrogen is more expensive. So there are costs associated with it. So that's not why we ask every single facility to have 50% renewable hydrogen. We ask the member state to make sure that that happens. That's one thing. Now, the second element is that I think one of the key aspects that we want to do is, of course, have this climate neutral economy with the industry. That's absolutely clear. And here, I think whatever your investment is going to be, and I think a lot of industries are, yes, if you look at the steel or ammonia plants, etc., they are relatively old plants. They've been here for 40, 50 years. So we have now a decade where they need to make investment decisions. What I think we want to achieve here is that you can make those investments here in Europe, because that means that your investment that you do now for 20 years is also actually viable for 20 years. Because in Europe, we create this situation where we have a climate neutral economy. If you do your investment, but it's the same investment as you've done in the past based on fossil fuels somewhere else, of course, that might be possible. But I think there again, hopefully the world as a whole has moved much more towards a very low carbon world. So I think that's something which is definitely not forgotten. And I think that's also why those targets have been explicitly put on member states, not on the industry itself.
Okay, and maybe we will come back with a CBAM, with the certification of the product, how to protect the settled product, and we will open another debate. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to Ruud. I mean, because I think it was a good debate with, or let's say, obviously your support and experience, and we will come back. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you a lot.
Yeah.